The Europeans who enslaved Africans in their colonies in the Americas had actually begun enslaving them in Europe in the mid-15th century, more than 50 years before developing the Transatlantic Slave Trade.
The Portuguese peoples were the first of the Europeans to be engaged in the human traffic in Africa. The first cargo of African slaves went to Lisbon in the 1440s. I think it was 1444. And this began a very active process of trading in West Africa and West Central Africa by the Portuguese peoples. And they played a very fundamental role in the making of modern Europe. The British also, incidentally, had a number of African slaves. We don't think of England being a place where Africans existed as slaves. But when the British abolished slavery in 1772, there were probably as many as 20,000 Africans who were then enslaved in that nation.
To justify enslaving Africans, all kinds of religious, scientific and intellectual arguments were used. The Church defined Africans as soulless savages who could only be saved by being brought to Christianity, even if they were worked to death in the process.
The Portuguese, for example, would baptize their captives before loading them on to slave ships. So, but you know, to understand this as a kind of religious conversion is in fact obscene, and we also know that from places like Congo, what Christian conversion meant in Africa was actually the expansion of the slave trade. So the conversion of the Congo kingdom to Catholicism actually opened up that kingdom to the slave trade, and those Catholic converts were primarily involved in the slave trade.
Scientists invented the concept of race and developed theories of racial hierarchy and of the congenital inferiority of blacks, which became the basis of European racism. Africans were said to have no history, no culture, no civilization.
Hubo una distorsión en la historia, que la historia fue cambiada a propósito, entonces para justificar la compra y venta de esclavos, ¿no? Suponía que eran personas que no eran personas.
In no instance were the other groups racially stigmatized by the enslavement, whereas with the enslaved African population, this stigmatization became a global phenomenon in and of itself.
In the slavery systems of Africa and elsewhere, the humanity of enslaved people was generally assumed. Sometimes they could be integrated in the enslavers' families, rise to position of power, even become royals. The system of slavery that Europeans created in the Americas was unique in that it became very quickly racialized. After the failure of the enslavement of native populations, only Africans were enslaved in the Americas. This system of chattel slavery sought to dehumanize its African victims. The millions of Africans torn away from the continent during almost 400 years and their generations of descendants were not defined as human beings. The French and Spanish Black Codes, laws that were written to regulate slavery, defined them as movable property. And the United States Constitution characterized them as 3/5 of a person.
In the European language, what we see is the birth of human commodities, right? That slaves are defined by their capacity to work, or that they're defined as a kind of, money equivalent. The effort to kind of to strip Africans of their humanity is actually seen in this early language that's used to describe what a slave is. And it's a commodity that's equivalent to other commodities.
Packed tightly into the holds of ships like other merchandise, almost a fifth of these Africans perished in the inhuman conditions of their horrific journey across the ocean. A journey that could last from 6 weeks to more than 2 months, depending on the points of departure and arrival and the weather. Upon arrival, They were sold at public auctions. Upon purchase, their existence was recorded not on human population censuses, but on their owners' property lists, along with cows, pigs, horses, and household furniture.
Véritablement, on est dans le cadre de l'esclavage le plus dur qui ait existé et sans véritablement d'issue.